It's off mute, you're good.
Okay, so we are back in session, and we're gonna hit item E, the Upper Rogue River Public Outreach and Potential Rulemaking. Alan, I guess.
Here, Jackson.
It says Warren, but I guess we're having Alan.
It is Alan. Thank you, Chair Jackson and the board. My name is Alan Hansen. I'm the Policy and Environmental Manager. I'm here to provide updates on the Oregon Kitchen Table project on the Rogue River. In the board material, I provided you with a summary of what the process was. So I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm not going to repeat a process or that information. So yesterday we received a draft preliminary report from the OKT process. We're expecting the preliminary final report tomorrow, and then the final report, I believe, is early August. So through this process, there was approximately 3,000 participants overall in the engagement activities. Over 2,000 people submitted surveys, and I believe they said there was about 500 people who attended in person to the 4 events. And so there was a fairly high level of participation in this process. I'm not sure how much we anticipated, but we certainly got a high level of participation. So a couple general themes from that process. People highly value the river. Different stretches are appropriate for different activities. There's disagreement as to what should and shouldn't be allowed. There's a high level of conflict amongst the participants. And some of the things that they were looking for would be increased regulation, commercial jet boats, mini jet boats, or commercial rafting, separate motorized and non-motorized uses, ban commercial jet boats on the entire or certain sections. So they've requested certain rules to be put in place. They also have concerns regarding erosion, fish habitat. Those are things that we're going to need the support of DEQ, ODF, and W to address. But I think the goal is, at this point, we have evidence that there's a significant amount of controversy. And so I think it's appropriate that we would open up a rulemaking process to allow us to further delve into this. The plan would be, for now, if you could open up the rulemaking in October, we bring back options. We develop the options, meet with participants in the community, figure out if those will address the problems, and bring those options back to you. And then you guys could determine if we want to move forward with actually developing rules or selecting one of those options. And of course, do nothing would be one of the options. And then, they would vary. We'd probably have one, separate the river into 2 sections, depending on the boundary, and those are things that we'll figure out and present to you at the October board meeting if you choose to move forward. And in participating in the process, there's been an ongoing controversy, so I think it's also appropriate that we do open rulemaking, just so that, and regardless of what happens, so that we can resolve that, yes, the Marine Board is going to do something, or no, the Marine Board doesn't think there's an issue that we're going to, is appropriate to address. So I think going through the process, regardless of the outcome, would be important.
And so, just for clarification, because of the process, and a lot of people don't understand that just because we open rulemaking doesn't mean we're going to make rules. It just means we're going to do our fact finding. We're going to engage, because one of my concerns is that through the process of the Oregon Kitchen Table, yes, they had 3,000 participants. Yes, they had, with the surveys, they had 500 people that participated in their events. How many of those were repeats? How many of those were the same people at each of the events? How many of those surveys came from individuals and weren't just repeated?
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of there aren't any metrics that show that that data is actually reliable.
Correct. Absolutely. So that would give us the opportunity to really vet the results of the OKT process, gain an understanding for ourselves, to understand what's fact, and then present to you guys to determine, how you want to choose to move forward, if you choose to move forward.
So, just as a follow-up, and because you were a couple minutes late.
I appreciate that, thank you.
I want to ask you, so when we actually decided to continue with the Oregon Kitchen Table process, one of the reasons was because we had never engaged as the Oregon State Marine Board in this process before and seen it work. So, from a standpoint of an interagency collaboration in fact-finding, I would have some concerns regarding some of these, and of course, we don't have the final draft yet, but, how do you feel about the process and its, its processes? Do you think it is a valuable tool to utilize in the future?
So, thank you, Member Early. I think it is valuable from the perspective, it separated the agencies from the process, because one of the things that I think they did a really good job at is, find out what the community wants. And so it took the focus away from the agency so that the people weren't coming and saying, you Marine Board, you need to do this, you need to do, X, Y, Z. So they were just able to come in and say, how do you use the river? How would you like to see it in the future? And just, look at it on a holistic level, not just what the agency focuses on. Because I'm sure if Parks was there or acting independently, the focus would be on what Parks could do. If we were there to view on voting rules, if, DEQ, DSL, the focus would be specifically on the agency. So this way, the agency was taken out. So I think we got a good holistic opinion of how it should be used. It's not to say that it's accurate.
Right.
It's all based, well, what I've seen, it's all based on individual opinion. So we need to be able to look at those opinions, understand what's fact, what's not, and then make recommendations as we determine are appropriate based on what we've determined the facts are.
Well, one of the advantages that I was looking at for the Oregon Kitchen Table process was just what you are highlighting right there, and that is the interagency collaboration, or bringing all together those agencies. Because, as a voting agency, there have been times when we've tried to engage other agencies and have not been successful. So that was the part that I was super excited about, seeing this process work and how it would work. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think, at this point, what I would like to see is, there were participants from Parks, ODF and WDSL, is if we could meet as a group of agencies and figure out what all of our takeaways are from the process, so that we could kind of allocate that says, okay, Parks, maybe you need to do X, Y, Z, DSL, here's your piece, Marine Board, here's what we can do. And so we can come at it from a holistic perspective, not just an individual.
And is that planned?
I
remember early, whenever we get information and output from Oregon Kitchen Table, we meet as a group, and I think
Okay.
there's been leadership, is committed, all of us. It's a significant investment financially, even just in the time that we'd all like to get some value out of that. So I think that will happen. The Marine Board is probably a little ahead of the curve of some of the others are talking about it, just because voting was a big piece of the conversation. And as you know, our processes take a lot of time. So we did discuss waiting until October when some of that final piece was done, but we thought today it's just sort of that opening that doesn't really commit you to doing anything other than asking staff to explore and bring back. And we would expect at the October meeting to have some invited testimony, including kitchen table people coming and presenting, folks from the jet boat industry coming and presenting, people from the River Guardians, the Rogue River Guardians presenting, just to really give the board a chance dive in and have discussions with people. That seemed to work well on some of our other issues, is to pick out some key leaders and let you have a focused conversation.
Would that be in a workshop type setting then?
That's the anticipation, remember early, so I guess precursor to item G is that we would anticipate at the next meeting, which is, then I'll remind you all, the 22nd and 23rd, not the 23rd and 4th, as it says on the agenda. The Tuesday afternoon, we would do that invited testimony piece so that you all had time to hear from people in the community directly and to make sure that we get a real balanced viewpoint so that you hear that. And then, you know, as Alan was mentioning, between now and then, if the board was to open rules, our job as staff would be to start trying to formulate some options and rule language so that you could think about that in October. And as always, and I know many of you have been a part of it, just because you open rulemaking doesn't mean you always have propagated rules.
My concern is when we open rulemaking, we're taking the lead on the issues, and I haven't really seen the report, neither of you. So I don't know that we've allowed the process to play out yet before we take the action to open rulemaking. I'd like to see the final report, and certainly after the final report, all the participants are going to have comments and input. I think, in my view, we need to see how that goes and let the process play out before we engage in rulemaking and our own hearing, our own process.
I'll just add, I went to your questions, remember earlier, I went to 3 of the 4 meetings. The first one that was virtual was pretty dismally attended. I think there were only like 20 people on the virtual call, give or take a few. The 2 other ones were pretty well attended. There were repeat attendees, absolutely, at those, and then some new faces in between. While I thought that the process was helpful in bringing the agencies together, absolutely, there were representatives from all 4 agencies there, and it was a collective effort to the public, you could tell. It did paint a very broad stroke conversation. I mean, this section of the river that we're talking about is super complicated down there. I mean, there's different issues, whether people have issues or concerns with commercial jet boats or recreational jet boats or mini jets. There's a whole bunch of different issues, and those are very specific to different stretches of the river. And a lot of that detail wasn't really kind of presented by the Oregon Kitchen Table team. It was really just a handful of questions that were asked of, do you think nothing should be done? Do you think education and information should be, enhanced? Or do you think we should go towards some sort of restrictions? And I think a good portion of the people just said, yeah, we should go towards restrictions. And the restrictions that were being thrown at were pretty vague until you started asking follow-up questions and really digging in. So I think some of the information that came, what will come from that Oregon Kitchen Table process is going to be really broad. And my interest is having conversations with the community to get deeper and down into the real nitty-gritty of the issues, because I don't anticipate, from my own just involvement in the process, I don't anticipate the values-based information that we're going to receive out of that Oregon Kitchen Table process being enough for us to kind of determine a path forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Member Lambert. And what they're gonna present is, the very broad, they're not making recommendations as to what an appropriate rule should be. And so I think regardless, we understand what's coming back. The general information, just a summary of the process. And like you said, you had attended 3 of the meetings. I attended 2. Phil attended 3 as well. And so we have a fairly good understanding of what the conflict is and what some of the community members wanted to see. But I think it's, the value is going to come moving forward, and having the Marine Board and the other agencies really, come up with some concepts and present those concepts to the community to see if that's something that they would think appropriate. And of course, what you would think appropriate.
I tend to agree with and my vice chair earlier was saying that having gone through a real controversial river stretch a couple of times, there's this perception like a popularity contest, and the form letters that all say the same thing, and the form letters that don't even bother to change, like, hi, my name is, and I live at. So, and like the folks were saying today, one of the phone calls and the people that came in person about a lot of disinformation and misinformation being thrown around. I mean, I think opening rulemaking gives us a chance to delve deeper into what is fact, what is misinformation being propagated. And I mean, I think there may be merit to actually changing something. There may not. There may be merit to doing nothing. I don't know enough about it. So I would support opening rulemaking and having some kind of, like we did on Newburgh Pool, where we had like several different panels of people come and present their views, and that we could talk to them in an somewhat informal setting.
So you would envision some type of advisory committee being,
Not really. Remember, I think it was like 2019.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
went down to the ODOT,
Mhm.
and there was just like 4 panels of invited
Right.
folks, of homeowners and boaters and law enforcement and whoever. And they kind of presented their views on the
so
issue.
we're really still developing the issues and concepts that we might move forward with as far as rules or whatever.
I think just clarifying the issues.
Yeah.
Because what it sounds like they're gonna come back is that, you know, these concerns that they have, the majority of the people are suggesting regulation. Whereas if we go out and we do our own fact finding and we find that, you know, additional regulation may not be the avenue, maybe it's additional education. And so, but without having the formal process, and the other thing that I'll say is that opening rulemaking now makes sense to me, because knowing how long the process is, if we did decide by spring that some form of rule would be necessary, then we would have the opportunity to possibly put that into place, not before maybe next season, but, you know, potentially some kind of a rule could affect businesses. And businesses need to plan for future activities. And it's only courteous that we try to accommodate that timeline.
So I agree with everything you said, but it seems like that was the intent and purpose of the kitchen table process. And you're saying that's not gonna achieve what we really want.
It doesn't sound like it. It's more of if according to what Alan and Steve were saying, or, I'm sorry, Member Lambert, were saying, is that it really was more of a broad conversation, and it wasn't coming back with it. I think I had the same vision that you did, was that we thought that they were gonna come back with actual recommendations, but it doesn't sound like that's the case with the Oregon Kitchen Table.
And I think part of that is just, again, reminding that there's 4 agencies involved and different authorities. And, you know, I think every kitchen table engagement that I've seen has been a little different, that I've gone and read on. And, you know, if we were one agency asking for one very specific set of outreach, and it might have come with that, but when it serving 4 different agencies, 4 different statutory authorities, 4 different boards, I think that baseline of information and understanding gives each agency at least a starting point to think about what they do or don't want to do. But expectation's always been, I think, that the board, each individual organization would have to take it to that next step. And I look at it like, you know, our rulemaking processes can take long. As some of you might remember, some of our previous ones have taken over 1.5 years to complete. So I think the kitchen table is, you know, it's set a foundation, and now if you think, you know, funneling, next step is we just dig a little deeper. And opening the rulemaking is just typically the board's way of telling staff it's okay to go spend some time and get the information and get the panels, start looking at some options and see what information's available, and bring that back to you all for a more thorough discussion.
Is there any kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like a partnership agreement amongst the agencies? For example, down on the road, there's the bridge, and above the bridge, it's an ODF&W rule that says no jets, right? Is there any kind of partnership agreement within this organization that sort of, you know, we can do it or they can do it? You guys can do this or we can do this. But it makes more sense if you do it rather than us doing it. Is there any kind of like ground rules within the 4 agencies along those lines?
I get it. Well, there's certainly not a formal partnership, but you know, a recognition that we all sit on the same natural resource cabinet and report through the same governor policy advisors, and a recognition that the governor's office would like us to always, you know, work together and see where our authorities lie and look at issues together. But also a recognition that at times we do have different statutory authorities and we do have different relationships with customers. And so some flexibility that there may be individual decisions. I think candidly, and as you look at a lot of the comments and input, I don't think it's lost on anybody that the 4 of you are most likely to have to deal with some of the bulk, but that doesn't mean that, you know, Parks, DSL, Fish and Wildlife won't also be looking at the recommendations and thinking about how their organization would be impacted.
Is it possible to, you know, we're talking about getting more information from the folks that use the river. I think we mentioned adding it on to the Tuesday before the next meeting, which is on the other end of the state in Hood River. Is it possible to have a special separate meeting down in the Jackson County area where constituents don't have to either zoom in for a kind of a complicated conversation, travel all the way across the state?
So Member Lambert, that would be really up to the board. We have in other cases, you know, unfortunately, we schedule these out, you know, several years in advance, so we don't know where the next issue is. So we've got a history of having the situation you described. When we do staff-led meetings, they're in the community. So, you know, at some point there'll be some, if we continue down the path further, past October, there'd be rule hearings in the community, there'd be those things, and those are done with staff in the community. But it really is, the board's prerogative on that, if you would prefer that to be in, that area. But we have good, bad, or indifferent in the past stuck, you know, in, because we schedule them out and kind of get things going, but certainly that has always been a challenge, right? Is we don't know where the next issue is going to be when we schedule them 2 years out.
Yeah.
Well, and does the workshop need to be done in conjunction with the board meeting?
No, you know, remember early, and then I guess always, if the board said, you know, we would prefer to do this in the area, what we would probably do in that case would be just separate that. I think it would be beneficial to have it before the meeting in Hood River. So probably, I don't know if that's a week or 2 or, you know, what makes sense there. And then we would just schedule it and notice it as a separate meeting. And we certainly have plenty of time to meet all of our noticing requirements to do that, so.
Yeah, I would, just because we're talking about a large number of folks who live down there, I would prefer that we go to them rather than having them all have to go to Hood River or somewhere. The other thing is, this is an area I'm not super familiar with.
Okay.
So I personally would like to go down either with somebody who knows the area well or on my own and just kind of put the words from paper to actual dirt on the ground or water in the river. So I actually can really see like what it is we're talking about.
I would totally agree with Chair Jackson. I think starting this conversation in this capacity, a lot of people that are concerned with this stretch of the river, long history, we've been talking about this for a few years now. I think we owe it to that member of the state, those members of the state, to have that conversation down there, at least kick this off and go from there.
We had a lot of folks, was it 2 years ago when we had our meeting in Medford?
Goose Bay, we had one where.
We had one, I thought we had one in Medford or Roseburg.
I think it was in Lapine. It was in Lapine that we had so many.
It was, I'm thinking of the Medford one where a lot of people were talking about the jet issues.
Oh,
So, yeah,
Yeah,
It was the night before Climate Falls.
yep. Mhm.
so if the board, it sounds like there's, you know, if the board opens rules, sounds like there's also some thought that we would do that. I would say procedurally, what would be good is rather than trying to select a date now, that if the board says we'd like to do that, after the meeting, Jennifer would start to work with all of you to figure out availability, somewhere to have the meeting. We would start working with the panels. And I do think it would be good to have that a week or two at least before the main board meeting in Hood River, so that then the board can, in October, formally, no decisions would be made in the local meeting. You'd be gathering information, but then you'd be set to do that. And I think my only other question, certainly the invited panels with extended time and Q&A, is would the board at that meeting also just want to take general public comment like we do at a meeting where people get their
For sure.
2-3 minutes?
I think so.
I mean, this conversation's fascinating for me on multiple levels. I think the part that's missing for me that maybe could be filled in potentially with some of these conversations is just the data to go along with it, right? There's a lot of feeling, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of history here, and a lot of those emotions are coming through in people's conversations that I witnessed at some of these kitchen table meetings and at written testimony. But the law enforcement data isn't there, safety data isn't there. So far, the impacts, environmental impact, I haven't seen any data that's there. And for me to make a decision as severe as restricting use in perpetuity, I'm going to have to see some data. So my interest in this is just continuing the conversation a little bit, give folks the opportunity to fill in the blanks that maybe they didn't get in this OKT process and go from there.
100% with you, Lambert. I think that will be our goal, is to start gathering data, really understand the impact of the problem, and then develop some options based on that rather than pure emotion. But that said, I do think emotion is probably an important consideration, because unless we can bring the temperature down, there's going to be a continued, conflict down there.
So that lack of data was exactly the reason why I was hesitant about rulemaking. If we're gonna gather that data through rulemaking before we submit it. Because I was hoping the kitchen table would provide me that data, and apparently it's not going to do.
I don't believe that's part of, because in the process, they really weren't requesting data.
Yeah.
They were requesting, opinion, vision, those types of concerns. So our role will be to provide the data.
So I'd like to make a motion that we open rulemaking for the Upper Road River project, and schedule a workshop for sometime before our next Oregon State Marine Board meeting, preferably in the area of the subject of study.
One question is, do we have any issues that you can think of today that says, no, we're not going to consider X, Y, Z? Just so we have some sideboards moving forward.
So while we'll be putting that meeting together, staff will also be gathering information. So just kind of as always, as you consider the motion from Member Jackson, I think it would help staff if there's just complete non-starters. We don't want to go, start
Sure.
doing
I
that.
think that could be discussed outside of the actual motion.
Okay, I apologize.
No, I would second your motion, and because I think it's really important that we collect the data. So,
So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor of opening rulemaking on the Upper Rogue, say aye.
All right,
Aye. No opposed? And so let's take a moment to talk about what some of those sideboards might be for development of potential rulemaking. I think we've discussed a lot of the data that we would like to see. Does anybody want to contribute some sideboards?
I've never been in favor of restricting one voting public compared to another voting public, or giving preferential treatment of one voting public over another. I think that it actually needs to be focused on the safety aspect of things. I think that we need to get the data where the safety issues truly are. So I'm certainly not in favor of going into this process of finding a restriction somewhere. I would say that it's just the opposite. I would say that, I'd like to go into this process knowing that we can find, an ability to not restrict some boating activities. If that makes sense.
I mean, I think in my mind, I want to know more about what some of the actual impacts versus perceived impacts. Because again, I don't necessarily want to see a ban of a particular, but if there's a specific site where maybe it needs to be a no-wake zone, or a pass-through zone where you're not doing some of the donuts and things that like jet boats do. Identifying where those places might be and what some of the solutions to spot problems might be other than an outright ban.
I think I'm right there where these two are in that regards is, I'll just add on one comment to that is, I prefer to steer away from a general ban of any type of use. And I would prefer to steer away from something that substitutes as a general ban of any type of use, such as a blanket 15-mile-an-hour speed limit on 30 miles of the river that no jet boat is ever going to be able to get on a plane on 15 miles an hour, right? So it kind of by de facto is a ban. So focusing on the education and safety things are portion of it right now, until at which time maybe other data arises showing us what direction to go.
Mine are along the same lines. I don't want to assume there is a problem until we know you've identified a problem and you have the data to support it. Like people are saying there's an impact of the fish populations, but there's no data saying that is true. So we really need to base whatever we do on data. I would just as soon have no rules as to have a rule that's not based on facts instead of emotion.
And the other one that we've always been reminded of is somebody's going to have to enforce these rules. And so the more simple they are, the easier to enforce they are. It's going to make it a lot easier on law enforcement and make them actually want to go out and enforce the rules rather than not.
Or figure out how to enforce them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because all law enforcement agencies are lacking in dollars right now, so they don't have the resources to throw at something that's just an additional paper regulation.
I heard that in several of the meetings where people were saying that the rules now aren't being enforced, so we need these rules. And I was thinking to myself, well, they're not being enforced the way you want them to be enforced now. Creating more rules, how is that gonna be enforced or helpful?
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. Any more discussion on the Upper Road? All right, thank you. Next one is the board chair and vice chair